Hello, my name is Mark Moody, and I've put together this little presentation after a meeting that was taking place in Gloucestershire in the UK called the Enigma of Potentisation. And one of the many questions that came up is, how can homeopathy possibly work? What is the mode of action, the mechanism, if you like? So I've put this together and I hope it gives some positive feedback, actually. So, herbal, homeopathic and mainstream pharmacy work in somewhat a similar way to begin with. An object is taken from the natural world. In this case we've chosen a plant. And to this plant, once the leaves are stripped perhaps, we would add some alcohol, maybe some water in some proportion, and allow this mixture to steep, i.e. to let the something from the plant enter into a liquid medium. The liquid is filtered off and stored. This liquid is known as a tincture or a mother tincture. Now, in the pharmaceutical world, this tincture is treated a different way from this point in. If you look at a mainstream pharmaceutical practice, this mother tincture is processed further to get the active ingredient by chemical purification, or it could even be synthesized from something less and then concentrated, perhaps in some way made available for dispensary. Now let's look at pharmacy from the homeopathic point of view. The same mother tincture goes through a process that is fairly enigmatic, it has to be said. Mother tincture. In this particular instance we're making a centesimal potency, which means one part of the mother tincture is added to 99 parts of, otherwise as pure as we can get, alcohol and water, or ethanol and water. And this is then succussed, which means it is shaken in one way or another, maybe banged against a heavy leather-bound book, or just shaken in order to get a good mixture. This makes the first potency. We can then go on to a second potency by doing the same thing. We're taking one part of the first potency, added to 99 parts of alcohol and water, it's once again succussed. And we can go on doing this, one part of the previous potency into the next, with 99 parts of water, alcohol, again succussed, and we have the third potency, and this can go on and on forever. Now, this does meet with a few problems, one of which is often known by the name Avogadro, from Lorenzo Romano Amadeo Carlo Bernardetto Avogadro di Quarengo e Carietto, 1776 to 1856, who did some of the early work, which eventually, through Loschmidt, arrived at some way of understanding how many atoms or molecules of a substance there were in a certain, well, originally it was done in gas, so equivalent volume, but eventually to look at reactive equivalents in liquids as well. So if we look at the same process we looked at before, and we can assume that that mother tincture is molar, i.e. has 1 mole of the active ingredient or the tincture, then as we go through the process we go from the Avogadro number 6 times 10 to the 23 to 6 times 10 to the 21, because it's diluted 1 to 100, then 6 times 10 to the 19, 6 times 10 to the 17, and we come to a point where there will be none of the mother tincture left. But homeopaths, the homeopathic pharmacists, can and very often do go way beyond the point that there's nothing of that original mother tincture left in the alcohol and water. And to one way of thinking, this is an absolute absurdity, but it has to be faced. This is what the homeopathic pharmacies do and what homeopaths use. So the only way to understand in our current paradigm how homeopathic effects are evoked is to assume that it's not the remedy that has the effect. It's sometimes assumed to have a placebo effect, which means a pleasing effect, i.e. the person who is being treated has in some way responded to other aspects, like wanting to please the healer, or just getting something off their chest, some kind of middle-class neurosis. It's a theory. So we get cartoons like this. Great, son, you can put your shirt back on, I'll get your prescription for placebo. Oh, wait, crap, they're not going to work now. Ho, 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 ho. So, the homeopaths are mad, or something else is going on. And I'm exploring the option that something else is going on because I'm interested. Let's go back to that plant. It could be anything else from nature. And like anything else in nature, it has a mass, it's organic matter, and the way that we normally treat something like that is to look at the properties that actually work from a centre outwards, such as gravity, light. In other aspects we have magnetic poles, electric poles. What I would like to propose, and I won't be the first to do this, is that there is another way of looking at things in the world. That they're not just this content radiating outwards, but there's something, a context for this content. And the particular content can be worked with context can be worked with in exactly the same way as the point-centered activity. But we are hypothesizing that there are forces that come from the periphery. Their origin is not a center working outwards, but from the whole 360 degrees spherical periphery coming inwards. And very often these are considered to come from the stars and the sun and the planets, and sometimes called cosmic rays. But it's good to be clear right from the start that these aren't beams coming directly from those heavenly bodies, but they are spheres. The plane at infinity is the origin of these activities, and they are considered to have phases, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, interfering with each other or reinforcing each other, so that over time these are moderated, and we can have some insight into that moderation and therefore predict them, assuming the stars and the planets maintain approximately predictable courses. So the plant has both centric and peripheral forces bringing about the phenomena of life. This is going to be necessarily a fairly sketchy introduction, and later we'll look at the literature that can bulk this out. Now, in the pharmaceutical practices that we've talked about, taking the active ingredient, purifying, condensing, etc., this only takes one path. The hypothesis, assertion, conjecture that I would like to entertain here is that there perhaps another path to take the peripheral aspect of that plant and isolate that. So not just taking the plant and taking the content and removing all context, but taking those peripheral forces, if you like, the context, and using these also as a pharmaceutical preparation. This is the big question, the hypothesis. Is this possible? Can we do it? Well, I'm saying yes, and this is what homeopathic pharmacy is, and what how the biodynamic preparations have their efficacy. Now, it's a bizarre hypothesis for many, but I hope if there's goodwill it can be followed with the similar exactitude as the point-centered work. And here's a movie that I hope will stimulate the thought of how the water, when it moves, works with planar or the two-dimensional planar. I should have mentioned earlier that the peripheral forces have planar activities rather than linear. And here's the movie. So here we have a bottle of water, a demijohn, and to begin with we're going to work with it. Come on, play my darling, thank you very much. We're just going to add some ink into the relatively still water from a dropper. Splash! And this is fascinating, it's beautiful, but it's showing essentially what happens in as still as we can get it water. It's very difficult actually to stop water having its own internal eddies and currents. Let's watch this for a minute. Now, I'm not going to overinterpret here. What we've done now is swished the bottle around, and you can already get some indication, but again we'll add some water. And we can see the movement betrayed by the ink, and you'll see these swirling veils, these two-dimensional sheaths, which don't disperse readily into the surrounding media like a dilution would. And you'll see these beautiful dancing veils, maintaining some integrity, a little bit of mixing, and this wonderful pulsing on that central vertical plane, dropping down, rising back up. Now I put this film done on my kitchen table just to show you that moving water, and the vortex is just one form of this that enables us to see it quite clearly, moves in sheaths, in two-dimensional forms. Here's another one. Sorry, the camera kept looking for something to focus on. Put 2 drops of ink, 1, 2, and we get this spiraling, this beautiful dancing veils yet again. A little bit more turbulent and active. Okay, I'm going to move on. I think we have the idea how moving water, as in succussion, has some connection to the peripheries of atoms moving randomly. So, the hypothesis here is that by shaking the water and alcohol, we are finding some connection to those peripheral forces, and each time we throw away 99 parts and take one to the next level, we are reducing the centric. So we're taking away the stuff, the content, trying to capture the context or the formative forces partially responsible for that plant to have matter, which is avoiding or postponing entropy, i.e. it's alive. I'm trying to capture the living aspect of the plant or the mineral or animal. Is there any evidence for this? Can we really take those peripheral forces? Well, there is some evidence, some of which is pure, some of which is applied. Let's start with the applied evidence, i.e. the evidence from taking these peripheral forces and using them in the real world. Well, if you're not... there's 200 years of evidence with homeopathy on human subjects. Now, this is hugely controversial, and I really don't want to get more heat than light, but I will put that into the pile of applied evidence. But I think we can do more. A lady called Lily Kalisko works across the river from me up until 1976 and her death. She worked with smallest entities, as they were called at the time, on plants. You remember the cartoon and placebo? One can assume, although that's a conscious assumption, that plants don't really have the same ability to deal with their middle class neurosis and respond beyond what the remedy does. And this work is something in the agriculture of tomorrow that anyone interested in this subject should know or get to know, because it's phenomenal. The same has happened with application to animals, and I think we're somewhere in the ground between objective and placebo potential with animals, but it's there. And there are research teams using homeopathic or other potentized remedies with plants and animals, and indeed with soils, who are collecting evidence, some of which, it has to be said, is merely anecdotal and therefore scientifically suspect, but others of which is actually pretty robust. So I would suggest that those of you interested could look at the work of B.D. Max in New Zealand, Eureka in Italy. In Brazil there's 2 university departments working on homeopathy for farmers on their plants. In Cuba, great work. In Mexico, Communist Institute. Australia, the USA, India, Pakistan. All these places have evidence of some degree of robustness, some degree of rigour, but all people giving time because, if nothing else, there is conviction that these potencies affect plants. And there's a form of agriculture called biodynamics, which has been going since the 1920s, almost 90 years now. And it seems to be doing particularly well in the wine industry, but in many other aspects has a lot to offer by using substances taken from nature, prepared and stirred and given back to nature for very practical, real-world outcomes. But we can also look at more pure and academic evidence. And most recently, Stefan Baumgartner has been working in the University of Bern, because the people of Switzerland, where he works, requested, through popular vote or referendum, that the government give proper scrutiny to alternative medicines. And he was charged with the questions of the basics, i.e. what is the mode of action, what's the sphere of application, is it real or is it madness? And he's done splendid, academically robust, peer-reviewed work with models to demonstrate that within the levels of significance science demands for anything to be taken seriously, that duckweed and wheat responds to homeopathic remedies, and I recommend you follow his work. And one thing that homeopathy, I think, hasn't had, that is now available to us, is a mathematical, or in this case geometrical, approach. Some doing the numbers, or even more fundamentally doing the geometry on plants and showing the response of even dormant winter buds to the incoming forces, the influences, if you like, and that work is superb. Lawrence Edwards is the real hero with that work, and that's been taken on in admirable fashion by Graham Calderwood at thebudworkshop.co.uk. Check it out. We have new researchers because clearly these mechanisms are not manifest. They're not physical. It's difficult to see the footprints. But these new researchers include Frank Boerdich and Dorian Schmidt, and they are supporting the more standard research modalities in looking to pure evidence. Now, you're going to have to do your own homework, I'm afraid. There's nothing I can do to convince anyone. That's going to take place over time as we see things work better. So, if you are interested, there is literature on this whole field. There's some general literature, and there's some epistemological literature. Epistemology is known in German as Weltanschauung, a worldview, or theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know, and can this work be accounted for in a robust knowledge rather than the realms of fantasy, belief and magic? Well, I think Dr. Rudolf Steiner is a name who runs through all this work like Brighton through a stick of rock, and he has various works. The one I'm reading at the moment, and therefore at the top of my list, is called Anthroposophy and Science, looking at how the natural world, maths, experimentation fit together, and how the calculable world, which has very little reality, i.e., let's put that a different way, which can calculate everything about light except for the colours, let's say, how those fit together with the manifest 3D world out there. He's also written a book about the world of the senses and the world of the spirit. Don't get too hung up on the word spirit. In German, this has a different resonance than voodoo and ghosties and ghoulies, but more includes our mental world. Science Between Space and Counterspace, in the next book, Space and Counterspace by Nick Thomas, is looking from a very robust mathematical point of view at how these peripheral forces and the centric forces react together, and how some changes, some movements and twists and turns considered from one point of view, i.e. let's just say our normal 3D centric space, create difficulties for simultaneous understanding it from the other point of view, but that these are equivalent to stress and strain. So the response that is uneasy to accommodate in both spaces simultaneously in so-called linked materials reveal themselves as the forces of the world, such as gravity, has something, the gas laws, Boyle, and has something perhaps to say about certain enigmas like wave-particle duality. But for our point of view, open the door to a robust understanding of these peripheral forces, which can be called etheric formative forces in the language of Rudolf Steiner. The Nature of Substance, Rudolf Hauschka, a wonderful book considering many of these enigmas. Truth and Science and the Philosophy of Freedom, again by Rudolf Steiner, considering much more the epistemological view of how do we know what is the role of science in relation to what is real. And that's me. I've written a book, a little paper called Homeopathy for Plants, yeah right, which is either homeopathy for plants, yeah right, or homeopathy for plants, yeah right, depending on whether you're up for it or not. Looking a little bit at some of the history in a more chatty form than some of the rigorous books above. So we can look at other aspects here, other literature. For instance, if we just look at the first stage here, biodynamics, and Rudolf Steiner gave the agricultural course, 1924. But it's tricky stuff, and so there are commentaries, for instance, from Enzo Nastati, Glenn Atkinson, John Soper. And there is some good work on looking how that has been developed since 1924 in the intervening 90 years. And Lily Kalisko and Eugene or Eugen, her husband, and the work that they did together in the book called Agriculture of Tomorrow, I recommend highly. And some discussion points, for instance, Ernst Marty in the Four Ethers, I think shows how the peer review on Unger's earlier work means that this is developing in a healthy way. And I refer you again to the Bud workshop from Graham Calderwood, looking at how these forces impact on plants. But there's also the theory of knowledge by Rudolf Steiner. In particular, there's a chapter in there on how the difference between mechanics and organics, i.e. how the knowledge appropriate to things which are material only and mechanical needs a fundamental rethink when applied to things that are alive, organisms. That the assumptions that are fit for purpose for understanding the mechanical world are not necessarily those which will give us a firm grasp of the reality of living things. The Metamorphosis of Plants by Goethe. Steiner called Goethe the Kepler and Copernicus of the organic world because actually the full title of that first book is A Theory of Knowledge implicit in Goethe's Weltanschauung or worldview. And Goethe gave some, in an aphoristic form, some idea of looking at the way plants grow and manifest differently in different biomes. It's great stuff. There's a beautiful version from MIT which is illustrated, and I recommend that one. And that has been taken to a greatly extended. Goethe always wanted to come back to his work and extend it, but didn't find time in his busy life. But Andreas Sushantke has made a beautiful, inspiring job in a book called Metamorphosis. Beautifully illustrated, very clear, although dense text. It's not the sort of thing you can just drink in one. It really takes some chewing on to get all the juices out. And for those of you who would find that difficult, given the way that you learn, perhaps if you're an artist, you can work with Margaret Cahoon's book New Eyes for Plants to come to the same conclusions. And there are some books which use the geometry very specifically for, as in our little cartoon here, the plant between sun and earth. George Adams is a real hero of this work. We'll come across him a bit later, and Olive Witcher. They worked together and produced wonderful, robust books for those with a sort of visual, metamorphic imagination, but with the rigour of maths or geometry. There's an introductory book called Projective Geometry that Lawrence Edwards put together, which takes you like a textbook. And Olive Witcher put one together with the very same name, but it's a different book. Lawrence Edwards, again, is the man who, a great projective geometrician, looking at whether nature really does approximate to the ideal, i.e. the forms of the geometrical ideas. Are plant buds, is Mother Nature good at geometry, if you like? Does she produce in harmony? And what happens, for instance, during the buds over winter? And do we get real health as we approximate towards the geometrical forms? So what would you, what is the implications for the natural world of deformed bits of nature? George Adams, interpreter of Rudolf Steiner, is a collection that Olive Witcher put together for George Adams of Adams's work after his death. And in particular, there's a 1961 address to the British Homeopathic Society looking at how homeopathy may be the beneficiary of these forces, the universal forces as he called them in that particular publication. A great book, a great man. Again, I think what I would like to say about that book is it's got beautiful English but great rigour, a sort of mix, an ideal mix of wonder, science and human activity. So we've had a look at biodynamics. What about this potentizing process? This great book, Sensitive Chaos, also really beautifully done, beautifully illustrated, looking at water and the flows and these peripheral forces and why water is particularly suited to such things. John Wilkes was part of the team with Adams and Schwenk in trying to look at other implementations of this characteristics of water, and he wrote a book called Flow Forms, nicely illustrated, lots of real-world applications. And I'm going to push my own book because that's the kind of guy I am. I wrote one about flow forms as well, trying to make these ideas clear to me. Theodore Schwenk, who wrote the first book, his son took on the water, and with Wilkins and Jacobi has written a good book further elucidating water and its role. And there's a practical handbook of plant alchemy by Manfred Junius. I'm not claiming that we've got all the answers within the other streams. Plenty of people are looking at how to liberate these qualities from the natural world, and the alchemists were there before the anthroposophical people, and that's a very interesting book, at least for taking other ideas and finding different ways of doing things, these things. Rudolf Steiner wrote about that too. Hugo Erber also came away with new ideas about how to potentize and what it really means to extract these forces from matter. And George Adams again. Enzo Nastati has written a book. His own style is probably means that he's going to be one of the last to be allowed back into academic world with these ideas, but he's followed those ideas through with a fearless, no punches pulled style to pistes far off the main slope. So let's look at that third aspect, not biodynamics and potentization, but preparations and remedies. The basis of potentization research, Theodore Schwenk, who wrote Sensitive Chaos, did some early work, and that's available, quite a rare book. Kalisko again, Agriculture of Tomorrow. George Adams again, very much connected with this. Ernst Marty wrote a bit more than is just in the Four Ethers. Unfortunately I can't speak German, so I can't help there. Steiner has some amazing stuff on spiritual science and medicine, where he said that we can not just take the empirical work, the trial and error of homeopathy, but find a system, a mental system for choosing remedies, choosing the potencies, understanding them from first principles and applying them. He has some brilliant thoughts in there about the human body and why it is susceptible to homeopathic remedies as well as more chemical, substantial remedies. Even in 1921, when he gave these lectures, I think it was 21, people were fighting between the homeopaths and the allopaths, so-called, i.e. those using peripheral and centric remedies. And he said, you can stop your fighting, you just need to know why the law of similars occurs and how it relates to material remedies, and truly complementary rather than just a political correctness way of talking about these remedies, but how they truly can complement each other. Okay, and Johannes Rohan, he was kind of of Gray's Anatomy of the US. He was, for many years, an anatomist who published and students would be given his works to understand the human body. But on retirement, he followed up an interest that would have been academic suicide during his career, and looked at the body in a way that follows Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science and medicine, so that each organ, each bone, the metamorphosis going through the different vertebrae as you go up and or down the spine, how those are the footprints of the same forces that we are considering here. And now that I think of it, I should have probably put an embryological text like embryogenesis, looking at that more rapid morphological set of changes of shape from sperm, gastrula, morula, all the way through to the neonatal baby, and as we grow. It's an incredibly interesting study, I believe. And again, we have much more to do with the applications: Cavirage, homeopathy for farm and garden; Consider, which is my own work, I'm blowing its trumpet again, collecting instances, both robust and merely, what would you say, yes, well, all the experiences I can find I've put together, whatever quality, as long as people stand behind them. BD Max, Eureka, Glenn in New Zealand, Enzo in Italy, all working with these on plants, on the land. I reckon it's worth checking out. Now, I've put a list of researchers in this whole field, ones who are alive. Stefan Baumgartner, we've mentioned. Lucietta Berti is about to retire in Italy, but also working within the academic tradition, looking for ways to demonstrate that this is not fantasy. Glenn, we've mentioned. Enzo. Dr. Waris Shah in Lahore, Pakistan, has done some incredibly good work with application of homeopathy to plants. Dr. Murthy in southern India. Me, Graham Calderwood, we've mentioned. Simon Charter works a lot with the flow forms and the water. Jonathan Code has led some interesting work looking at potentizing in groups. Dorian Schmidt and Frank Boerdig with their enhanced facilities for researching remedies directly. Now, how confident can we be that this is something that is worthy of attention, that it's not a fantasy of some deluded half-wits? Well, here's my level of confidence. Biodynamics, is it a real discipline? Yeah, 99%, 90% I've put here. I'm sure there's something in it. However, I think its potential has barely been revealed. It's just a start. There's all sorts of good and bad biodynamics. It's not necessarily better because it has these remedies. How to make the remedies, when to use them, in what circumstances, I think we're not far off the blocks with that one. Potentization, is there something real going on here? Well, from a mixture of the academic work I've seen and personal experience, I'll say there's something real here. It's not just dreamt up, but again, I feel that the potential is barely understood. We haven't scratched the surface. And are there applications of these, such as homeopathy and again biodynamics? Is that real? Yeah, I've given exactly the same score, and I think if we can really get a hell of a lot more from developing this discipline. So I've given all 90% for reality, potential 10, and I'm hoping that if these work step in hand, that potential can go up and up and up. For instance, if through the geometry we find the healthy buds and we potentize in the right way and we apply them in the right way, that potential will be staggering. This is me. If we don't think just me, but the Western mainstream, biodynamics, is it real? Well, probably not. You know, some of the wines might be a bit better, some of the research looks pretty good. and it's exhausted its potential because you're not going to do anything real in agriculture. I would parody the Western mainstream understanding. Potentization, nah, that old Avogadro burden, it's just diluting. It's all self-delusion. It's got all its potential realized already. It's which is really nothing. Okay, there's micronutrients might be just from the dilution, but otherwise, waste of time, mate. Applications, is it real? 5%, at most, because many people do it. But it's just a bunch of hairy homeopaths talking to neurotic people, and that's helping the neurotic people get something off their chest. So there's the placebo, but you're not going to improve that. That's 100% potential being realized. There's no point in trying to develop that. I hope I haven't oversimplified. So there are ongoing questions, for instance, with biodynamics. How can this become a scientific discipline, not a dogmatic one where we do what Steiner said and that's good enough for us? For various reasons, the growth of the discipline and the practitioners, I really think this is an ongoing, a real issue. Questions are there other means, not just biodynamics, to similar ends? What's it called, the Ringing Cedars books. There's other people looking at energy within plants. It could be elemental beings. I don't know which others are really genuine, but I think there's other allies out there flying under different flags. So compatible disciplines. Earth repair. Can we do more than just grow healthier, maybe bigger plants? Can we deal with some of the problems besetting us, such as pollution, radioactivity, GM? I happen to think that's worth looking at. Potentization, ongoing questions. Again, because of Hahnemann and Steiner, there are many people who are happy just to imitate, and it's quite become a static dogma, and I would hope that this can become more critical and burgeoning discipline. The question is, potentizing done at one time the same as potentizing done at another time? If not, why? The rhythm that the potencies go through, is that important? Is the duration of the shaking or the number of shakes, is that important? Which potency do we use for different applications? Does it matter if we shake up and down, side to side, back to forward, circles, lemniscates? Are there other means to bring about the liberation of these forces rather than just shaking in a lab in alcohol and water? Questions to do with the application. Again, the critical versus dogmatic approach to this whole subject. Does it matter when we apply to have an effect? What potency must we use? Can we repair the earth with these, with homeopathy, with potentized biodynamic preparations? And are there other means to do exactly the same? Who knows? Just prayer, invocation, chanting, banging drums? Do they do the same thing? Question. And then there's the big questions of whether these disciplines can realize their facets of one, and therefore we can collaborate. And how can we get funding at a time when all agricultural basic science work seems to be looking at GM and particle accelerators, just looking at the idea of the point-centered radiating forces and not these peripheral ones. So, thank you for hanging out with me. I have proposed some fairly fundamental rethinks, and that homeopathy and allied disciplines are the beneficiary of these other ways of looking at things, and I hope to look back at my clumsy cartoons in a few years and see that no matter how crude and badly phrased they are, God willing, it's the start of something that will reintegrate these disciplines into the mainstream to the benefit of all.